We have been talking quite a bit about the disabled person. We also have been looking into the persons with whom the disabled person interacts. And with a non-disabled person, one intellectually and also practically often has a choice. You can just focus on the person in isolation, or you can adopt what we have called the relational approach. But for a disabled person, the relational perspective imposes itself. And this is what I'm going to focus on in my presentation, trying to understand with the means of some experimental evidence to which degree we can count on it. Of course, the first and foremost thing, if we wonder how does a person interact with others who are disabled, is respect or enabling them to lead a meaningful life. And we have talked about that to quite some length. But sometimes this is just not doable. And in other contexts, it may not be the best thing we can do as not disabled persons. And then the question comes up, to which degree can we hope for active help, and in some contexts, even decision-making on behalf of others. And these are topics that the experimental literature has been quite interested in. So what I want to explore is the question, what can we expect from others and under which circumstances? My method will be very artificial. It will be experiments. An experiment is defined by the fact that you cut out as much context as you can. And therefore, whatever you come up with is by design only analogous, or as this literature often says, it has low external validity. Why do we do that? Well, because we believe that internal validity, as the literature would call it, is important, that we want to be able to isolate causes. And if we only have observational data, that tends to be tricky. So observational data we might be using in our context might be disability legislation, donation rates, or career choices if a family member is disabled. But in all of those, we have substantial risks of confounds. If we look at disability legislation, it of course also depends on the party system, on what the political scientists usually call the unruliness of political process. And for those of you who are a bit into quantitative analysis, there's also a problem of ecological inference in that we only know something about the fraction of people with disability in some society, and that makes it less reliable what we get out as a result. If we look at the donation rates, that's a bit closer, but we also would have to take into account how much income a person or how much wealth a person has whom we observe giving or not giving. And persons rightly do not exclusively care about disability. They care about many things. And if a person gives a lot, but gives a lot for other purposes than disability, that doesn't necessarily tell us something about the willingness in general to help the disabled. It's rather evidence on the conflict between alternative good causes. And a very important one is, of course, the tax treatment. Many countries privilege donations by some form of tax treatment that's beneficial to the giver. And to the degree that that exists, we would hope to get higher donations, but would have to factor that in at the moment when we want to learn something from donation rate data. And finally, career choices with disabled family members. The big non-known is what would have been the career choice of a person in the first place. So is there a family member for whom it's a big sacrifice to invest into care for the disabled person, as opposed to a family member for whom this is still hard labor, but something that seems much more natural? So again, things we do not know, and therefore things that would taint the possible evidence we can generate. The advantage of the experiment is that it randomly selects people and puts them randomly into some treatment. And therefore, if we find a significant difference between our baseline and our treatment, it must have been caused by the treatment manipulation. So that's the big trick that experiments play. Let me now try to use that toolbox to learn something about the two questions I want to address. The first being, to which degree can we hope that others are going to help? This is one nice picture of Saint Elizabeth helping the poor. So to which degree do we have reason to be confident that active help is likely to be given? The first piece of evidence I'm going to use is a meta-study I've done a good decade ago about the so-called dictator games. The structure of that game is very simple. You have one active person who gets, usually by the experimenter, some amount of money, and she is paired randomly with another person, and she has power to give any part of her endowment to the passive person and can keep everything. And if you first look at the left part of the panel, at the left panel, the left part of the graph, you see that the majority of people are straightforward selfish. If you give them $10, they say, well, that's fine for me. I keep $10, the other person gets nothing. About 40% of participants on average do that. But you see that if the other person is another participant in the lab, then a substantial minority, a little less than 20%, give the equal split. So they say, well, that's not just that I get something and the other gets nothing, so let's split it half-half. And then you find a number of persons who sort of trade selfishness against their social inclinations, and they give something. I guess you can, no, you won't be able to see my mouse, but something, but not everything. The reason why I bring this up is the right part of the panel, because that's experiments, otherwise completely same design, that have chosen a different recipient. The recipient is sometimes a charity, it's sometimes individual persons in need. There are several ways of manipulating that in the experiment. And if you compare the left and the right part of the panel, you see a stark difference. So first, the mode, the most popular choice, is no longer keeping everything. The mode is on the right-hand side of the panel. So one is meaning everything I have is given away. The second thing you see is that something which is almost unheard of if the other person is just another participant, left panel, becomes the most popular choice. So if you are learning from the experimenter that there is somebody in need to whom you can give, then your manna from heaven that you have gotten from the experimenter is very likely to go to this person in need. And then, of course, there's some intermediate choices. You can also slice the same data a bit more in a bit more fine-grained manner. Here, I'm only looking at experiments that have manipulated the degree of deservingness of the other person. That, of course, you can't do if your recipient is a charity. But what you can do in the experiment is that you say, your recipient isn't poor. Your recipient has the same amount of money as you, so that would be the right hand at my graph, so the one. Or the recipient has less than you, but not nothing. And you see this very nice line that the more the other has, read, the less the other is in need, the less this person gets. Or the other way around, the more the other person has nothing, the more my experimental participant or the experimental participants feel the urge to give at least a certain part. You see the average is around 27 or so %. So They don't give up being selfish, but at least on average, they give a fraction. Another experiment that we have done ourselves is also interesting in this respect. So that was also a dictator game, so in principle, same design. But what we have manipulated is the degree of information you get about the endowment of your recipient. So we take the same design that others have used in this graph, only that in the experiments reported on this graph were transparent about the amount the potential recipient had, whereas we created a situation in which the active player, the dictator, did not know how much the other had. And we manipulated the degree of uncertainty. I don't want to spend too much time on the details because the most interesting finding for our context is the rightmost bar. This is when we left them completely in the dark. So we told them there is somebody else in the lab, and this other person can have any amount of money at her disposition, from nothing to the same that you have. And if in this situation, the person who has authority, the powerful person, runs the risk of leaving another person with nothing, not knowing how wealthy that other person is, that's the situation where our participants gave most. So not being completely sure about the degree of deservingness is what creates a willingness to give even more. And all parallels are wrong, but if we want to draw a parallel to the question we are interested in, disability, in many respects, to which degree a disabled person needs help is something which is hard to tell at the outset. And we could therefore hope that extrapolating from this data, there might be a chance that the more, it's hard to say how much help they need, the more they are likely to get some help. A next experiment that we also have done a while ago looks at the willingness to make sure that the donation is not wasted. So that was a context where we manipulated either what the donations are used for. So with the main recipient was a clearly needy recipient, the Unite for Basic Needs, which cares about orphans. But with 20% probability, there was a risk that the money would be used for a board dinner. With the second treatment, there was a 20% risk that there would not be a tax reduction. So that was a 50% tax subsidy that was given in the experiment. And then we had the combined treatment where both of them were combined. And on this graph, I show you something which in our context may be less relevant, but I thought I would start here so that you can understand the next graph. So this was the willingness to even pay for the fact that the risk is not there. So to insure themselves against this degree of uncertainty, and the willingness was pronounced. But what I really, why I really wanted to show you this experiment is this graph, because it shows us that on the base, in the baseline, no uncertainty. And it was a needy recipient, so our participants gave a lot. They gave on average 73% of the endowment to this charity. And if you introduce either of the uncertainties, that's the dark gray bars on the right-hand side, so either the effectiveness, the tax, or both of them, then you see that the willingness to give drops. Interestingly, much less so if they risk not getting the tax refund, and very dramatically so if they are afraid that the donation doesn't go into the channels they hoped that would get it, which makes it very strong that from the perspective of participants, it's really important what you give for. You are not giving for something. You are giving for a very precise reason because you care about this one reason. And now comes the most interesting part of the data. That's the light gray bars. Because if we allow them to insure themselves against the risk, so if they can pay extra money to remove this uncertainty that things could go wrong, all of a sudden their willingness to pay is back where it used to be if there is no risk. So you can even contain the risk that the donation goes wrong. In my final minutes, I'd like to move over to decision-making on behalf of others, and again, a nice picture to illustrate what I'm interested in. This relies on an experiment with two colleagues, and the task, those of you who have listened to a presentation of mine before will remember the task, because I talked about that experiment in another context already. The task is you have to choose between two lotteries. The red bar is what you get in the goods in the bad situation, and the blue bar is what you get in the good situation, and each situation has equal probability of obtaining. And if all you care about is money, then you would go to the utmost right, so you would run as much risk as you can, because the expected value of what you are going out of this is much higher, because we double up. So with each degree of risk that you take, you invest into getting even more money, but you still face the risk of, with 50% probability, it can go wrong. So it's only an expectation a good deal, whereas if you are sufficiently risk averse, you wouldn't do it. That has, of course, nothing to do with our question, but what has is that we did that within families, and that we always gave that same task to two family members, and first had to do them individually, do that task individually, and then we would pair them. And now there's multiple conditions. I won't go into them. The one of interest here is when one family member decides on behalf of the other family member. So now it's risk-taking not for myself, it's risk-taking for someone else. So to how much risk do I expose the other person is the one side of the question. The other side of the question is by being cautious, to which degree do I deprive the other person of the possibility to make even more money? So it's this trade-off between running risk and becoming potentially more wealthy. And the interesting part in this graph is the peak in the middle. So the dependent variable in this graph is how does my own choice differ from the choice that I make if I decide on behalf of the second family member. And the peak in the middle says those persons don't care that they decide about others. They just stick to what they themselves would have done. But we have quite a few people who do something else. And interestingly, those who listen to the needs of the other person are predominantly on the left-hand side, not on the right-hand side. And the interpretation is they're predominantly shifting to a more cautious decision. So they listen in particular if they have the impression the other person is more risk-averse than I am, and then move into that direction. Whereas only a few say, I want to teach this person a lesson and go into even higher risk-taking. So what's the bottom line? I hope we can end on a line of cautious optimism. Help is certainly not something we can expect from everybody, and we can't expect to get it fully, but quite a few people are sensitive towards the severity of the need. When in doubt, they give more, and they even go out of their way. I showed you the insurance data. And if decision-making on behalf of the disabled person can't be avoided, then they tend to be sensitive towards their autonomy and would rather err on the cautious side. So let me end on misericordia seems to be real. Thank you.